Well, it's certainly good to be with you this evening. Looking forward to studying God's Word together. I know that you have had good preaching. I have to follow Marshall up every Sunday, so I know what that's like already. I'm used to it. We asked Marshall to come work with us at Pepper Road almost 2 years ago, and I have been in his shadow both literally and figuratively ever since. But we love having him there. I love the work that he does, and I know he did a good job here. The last time I was here, we talked about the subject of faith. I'd like to talk this evening about a subject that I think is right alongside of that this evening, that is grace. One of the things that strikes me is that among people who grow discontented and frustrated with the church, one of the complaints that I hear most often is we just don't hear enough preaching about grace. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that charge, but I'm happy to oblige somebody that says, I want to hear more sermons on grace. Fine. I don't know that they'll appreciate the kind of sermons they hear, because a lot of times what people mean is, I don't hear enough sermons where the preacher is saying the things about grace that my Baptist friend says about grace. Well, I'm sorry, I can't help you there. But I can talk about grace, I think, in the way God's Word talks about it, and I can do that as often as you like. And I'd like to do that this evening, and I'd like to start in Romans chapter 6 and in verse 14. Romans chapter 6 and verse 14, it says there, "For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." Now, what do you make of that? I think that different people hear different things when they read that Paul says you are not under law, but under grace. Some people hear that you're not under law, which means when you talk about law, it's a rule, it's stated, and you have to do it. No, you're under grace. And what grace means is that there's something that you're supposed to do, and you really ought to want to do it, but it'll be all right if you don't. I think that's kind of a basic concept. I don't think maybe people would word it that way, but it's kind of the idea that you get if you talk to them very much. And then maybe we might modify it a little bit. We might say, some people's idea, and this is a little bit closer, would say, yeah, the law strictly says you have to do it, and if you don't, there's death is the punishment. But with grace, you have to do it, but if you don't, then you can go get forgiveness. And so you got law, we still are under law because we still got the rules, but now we've got grace to kind of help us when we don't obey the law. And I really don't think that that's the idea either. I think that there is not grace and law in conflict in the way it is in some minds, but rather there is there's a certain way of looking at God's law that Paul defines as law. And then there's another way of looking at God's laws that I think is in total harmony with grace. And in fact, having a mindset of grace and a relationship of grace helps you understand what those laws even mean. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit as we go along. I do want to suggest something to you. I don't have time to go into it. Presented a series of lessons on this at Pepper Road. But just to go ahead and get into your mind that grace is a reciprocal relationship. And what I mean by that is it goes both ways. One of the problems when people come to this is they think grace is what God gives to me, and it has nothing to do with what I give to God. But it is both ways. And one of the ways you can see this, in our Bibles, we have a word that's often translated thanks or thanksgiving. It'd be probably better if it was translated gratitude, because then you could almost see the word grace in that word. But it is the word grace. So when Paul says, I give thanks to God, he's saying, I give grace to God. Now, how can you give God grace when we define grace as God's unmerited favor towards men? Well, you certainly can't give him that. Right? Whatever it is Paul's given God, it's certainly not God's unmerited favor towards men. In fact, it's certainly not unmerited. Whatever you give God, it's going to be merited. So grace as a concept, I think it certainly can be unmerited, but it also can involve merit. It can involve works. It can involve a reciprocal relationship where we're both doing things for one another, and I think that that's what we'll see some of as we go along in this lesson. That demands more time and attention, but I just want to illustrate that in some ways this evening. So I want to start with that idea that grace can and does in Scripture make demands. That grace is a demanding thing. As I said, you've got this concept of a command. Here's a command that's given. Law says you have to do it. Grace says you should want to, but you shouldn't have to do it. I don't think that that's what grace says about a command. I want to look at the idea of love, a gracious relationship, and some of the things that Jesus says, using the word love, which I think is an overlapping concept with grace. In John chapter 14 and verse 15. You know this verse where Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Chapter 15 and verse 14. He says, you are my friends if you do what I command you. Now, to use the modern vernacular, we might call that a toxic relationship, wouldn't we? Like if you had a friend that said, listen, we can be friends as long as you do everything I tell you to do. Well, I mean, that would work out for one of us. But I don't know that we want a relationship with somebody that says our relationship is founded on the premise that you'll do everything I tell you to do. Or somebody that says, if you love me, you'll do everything I tell you to do. That sounds unhealthy to us. I think we just accept it because it's Jesus saying it, but I think it demands some thought process, doesn't it? Now, I will say, in a peer relationship, that's kind of problematic. But in a master-slave relationship, it's not as problematic. In fact, it's not problematic at all. And I think that we have some places where we understand that to be the case. I had some coaches who kind of talked like this a little bit. They would say, listen, you just do what you're told. You show respect and you do everything I ask you to do, and we'll be friends. You ever have somebody like that in your life? Yeah, and so, and you can really and truly grow to love those kind of men. I mean, they shape young men's lives with that kind of language because you understand the dynamic there. Now, I will say, even at a peer level, though we wouldn't use necessarily this language at a peer level, I will say, if in a friendship you disregard my will and don't care what my will is, we really can't be friends, can we? If at every turn you just ignore everything I say or want or think, well, we're not friends. I can be nice to you, but we're not friends. And so I do think we understand that concept, that in grace-type relationships, there can still be demands. Parents and children. When do we get along best, parents and children? When our children are obedient. That's what we say to our children. We could get along so well. You know, we could be friends of a sort. How? Not by me getting on your level, but by you just listening and doing what you're told. And then that makes the relationship better, doesn't it? In both directions, in fact. And that's what we'll see as we continue along here. Grace demands more than law, not less than law. This is one of the most important aspects, I think, as you read Romans 6:14, and he says you are under grace, not law, that you hear a higher demand than you hear with the law. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, and there in verse 8, Paul makes some comments regarding the law. He says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, knowing this, that law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and godless, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for sexually immoral persons, for homosexuals, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. Now, what does Paul mean that the law is for those kinds of people, not for us? I think there's a sense in which the law mindset, that law that says, I will follow the rules and only that, the law is for those kinds of people. Over in Matthew chapter 5, I think we see an illustration, we see kind of an illustration of the concept that Paul is describing over in 1 Timothy chapter 1. Matthew chapter 5, and beginning in verse 21, you have this series of instruction from Jesus where it starts out, you have heard that it was said, or here in the Legacy Standard it says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be guilty before the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be guilty before the Sanhedrin. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. All right. So as we look at the idea here, and Jesus is he lowering the bar? No, of course he's raising the bar, right? It's you shall not murder is an insufficient standard to be saying that you are actually fulfilling the law by living by merely that standard. Now I think, on the one hand, we might say, look, it just says don't murder. But I think we understand how it works when we give commands that are baseline commands with greater expectations that go along with that. We understand that as parents. My mom, I don't know how many times she said something like this as she was leaving the house, going to get groceries and probably just going to find some peace. And she would say before she left, listen, please just don't murder each other, right? Now imagine if she comes home and my response is, listen, before you come in the house, I just want you to know we did not murder anyone. She's not going to be like warm and filled and say, oh good, you did exactly what I wanted. No, that was like a baseline minimum standard. And of course, giving that command is not permission to do everything else but murder each other. And it wasn't in Scripture either. Let me give you another illustration. Just imagine at Pepper Road that I got a call from one of our members, and he was plotting to murder another one of our members. And I went and I talked to him, and I got him to put the gun down, and we talked through it, and he decided, well, I understand it's wrong to murder. I'm not going to murder that member. And I go to our elders in our next elders and evangelists meeting, and I say, listen, one of our members was going to murder another one, but it's okay, I talked him out of it. I don't think they'd be like, well, that's good. I mean, he didn't violate the command. No problem. We don't even need to know who it is. It's not an issue, right? No, they would be like right here going, that's not enough. And so when Paul says that the law is for these kinds of people, the law is for somebody who needs to hear don't murder. Who is that? Hopefully that's not anybody in this room. Like if you're in a place in your life where you are desperately needing to hear don't murder somebody, boy, we got bigger problems, don't we? I tell people all the time, if you're coming to me to talk about your marriage, and I'm having to work hard to convince you that you should not commit adultery, we are way far down the line of problems, right? I want to be convincing you to love your wife, convincing you that you ought to be pouring yourself into that relationship. And if I'm over here, way over here saying, hey, don't destroy all of it, I'm nowhere near where I really want to be, which is here's how we build it up. And a lot of times people come in thinking that what they need is this, and they're at the edge of the cliff. That's what the law tries to do, is keep you from just jumping right off the cliff. But the ideal is to turn completely away from that and walk the opposite direction. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness. No, as Paul would say in Romans chapter 13, love your neighbor. That's what sums this up, isn't it? All these things. Now you do have to start maybe with if you walk into a room and there is that tense scene, and maybe somebody is about to take someone else's life, you don't get to start with, now really you ought to be saying kind things and loving that fella over there. No, you do have to start with, let's just put the gun down. Don't murder. But we don't want to stop there. We want to move on from there. And I think that is a gracious way to begin to think about the law, to think about what God has said. If you think in law terms, then you are satisfied that you have not killed anyone. But if you think in grace terms, you start thinking, what am I supposed to learn from thou shalt not murder? And how am I supposed to begin to actually think about my neighbor from that command as well as all of these others? Grace demands a total investment of self to understand the commands that are even being given. And if you don't invest yourself, you end up with some pretty weird interpretations. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is one of my favorite passages with regards to our relationship to God in our personal lives and the lives of our entire family. He says here, beginning in verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart." All right, so first of all, there is the investment. Everything that you have, everything that you are, all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your might or strength, everything goes into loving God. They shall be on your heart. And he says, beginning in verse 7, "You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as phylacteries between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So, what do we do with that? So here it says, love the Lord your God. And then he says, I want it to be in your heart. I want you to talk about it all the time. And here's what I want. I want it to be right here. I want it to be right here. And I want it to be on the doorpost of your house. And some people who didn't get the first premise, that is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, by the time we get to the New Testament, have taken the commands of verses 8 and 9, and they actually begin to construct little wooden boxes and strap them on their heads. And they still do. You can walk around certain Jewish communities and still see people with a headband and a little box, and in that little box is a portion of the law. And you might see a strap wrapped around their finger, and that strap goes up, and up here on their shoulder is another little box, and it's a phylactery. And they didn't just do that. They said, if I'm going to have a box with the law in it, I better make it look nice. And I better make it look nicer than that guy's. And so as Jesus says, they begin to broaden their phylacteries. They deck them out. Could you further miss what God is saying here? God says, I want my law to guide what's right here, what you think. I want it to guide what you do, your arm. And I want it to rule your house. And here people just miss the command. How do they do that? Because they're under law and not under grace. Under law, not under grace. That doesn't mean that they didn't really have to fulfill this command. It meant that they ought to have been actually fulfilling the command instead of this silly thing they were doing over here. That's what law make you do, won't it? Is it when you approach it like that, you think in minimum standards. I don't know how many of you do your own taxes. I do my own taxes. And I will just tell you that my goal in doing my taxes is in the nature of law. That is, tell me precisely what the law is. And I will do everything I can to figure out precisely how little I can pay the government. And I will tell you, if I began to explain to you all the things I do, it might sound about like strapping phylacteries on my head and on my arm just so I can pay a few dollars less to the government. And I'm sure in some of those cases, you might say, well, that's not necessarily why they made that regulation. What you're doing with that's not why they made that. Yeah, well, that's not my fault. They put it in there. I'm going to take it, right? Give me the deduction. Because I approach it like law. I don't approach it like, what could I do to please the IRS? What could I do to build a relationship with the IRS? All I want is those people out of my life. And so I approach it like law, not like grace. And in some ways you might say that is a great burden. But I'm going to tell you what, it's not near as demanding as the grace relationships in my life. The IRS does not demand as much of my time, attention. It does not demand my whole heart, my soul, and my strength. My wife comes a lot closer to that. That's a grace relationship. It's far more demanding than the relationship I have with the IRS. And yet, it is the one that I want. Even though it takes a lot less of my time and energy to deal with the law, and it takes countless hours and energy and effort to maintain relationships with one another, that's what we want. And it's what we want with God. And what we find is that especially in this relationship, that when we enter into it where we are thinking of grace towards God, not just trying to get grace from God in some sort of legal calculation, if I do these things, then He'll give me grace, but we come to Him with grace towards Him, then we begin to recognize the real value of what we have here. And the value of what we have here is not just that He will let you off the hook. I'm afraid, again, that's the legal perception, is that you need to follow these rules because God made these rules up and He's the boss. But when you come to God and you think of Him in the ways that you ought to, you find what it says in Deuteronomy 6 and verse 24. Yahweh commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear Yahweh our God for our good, all our days, and for our survival, as it is today. God doesn't just command you to do these things because He's a bit of a prude. He doesn't just command you to do these things because He's the kind of guy who likes to jump and see if you'll say how high. Our society is learning at ever more rapid rates that God's instructions were for our survival. And brethren, we are not surviving. We are suffering the consequences of thinking that God's rules have been arbitrary and that they don't have the consequences that, frankly, God told us they had all along. And so what we find is that if we would just do what He says, that we would find it for our good, or we would find, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 30, that His burden is light. Why is it light? Because it makes your life better. Isn't that what we try to tell our kids? Why you got to do it the hard way? Wouldn't your life be better if you just listen? I have had a couple of occasions, I have the dates written down, where my children said to me, "You were right." I remember one occasion where one of my daughters had not followed advice, and she was very frustrated at the consequences that had come. And I said, "Listen, I don't want to say I told you so." I mean, I kind of did, but I didn't, I don't want to say that. But do you remember what I told you? And she goes, you were right. And I'm going to tell you, I probably felt a little bit too good at that moment. But there is a sense of I am glad for the moment and the opportunity to see, and for any teenager to see, that your parents aren't just sitting around trying to figure out ways to destroy any joy in your life. They're actually sitting around trying to figure out how to maximize it. And that's what God is doing. Trying to maximize joy in our lives for all eternity. And we sit here and wonder, do I have to do that? We'll get to that in just a moment. And so we need to think in those kinds of terms. Well, how do we cultivate that kind of grace relationship where we are willingly and joyfully giving in to the demands of grace without falling into the trap of just turning into that law relationship? I want to bring up the story of Balaam for just a moment. I'll just tell you, as a young man reading through the story of Balaam in our Bible classes growing up, teenager growing up, I could not see in Numbers 22 through 24 what the problem was. Not clearly. I needed the New Testament to point back and say, here was the problem. Okay, well, now I guess I can see it with the help of those passages. But I want to suggest to you that if you're looking clearly, you can see the same thing the New Testament writer saw. And what you find as you're reading through there, one of the reasons why it's hard to see is because, look back over there at Numbers 22. Numbers 22 and verse 30. I'm just going to give you one example. This is all through the story of Balaam. Numbers 22 and there in verse 38. It says, so Balaam said to Balak, behold, I have come now to you. Am I able to speak anything at all? The word of God, the word that God puts in my mouth, that shall I speak. I want to tell you what, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And Balaam doesn't just say that once. He says that kind of thing all throughout. And so we kind of feel like, man, Balaam seems like he's on the right track and maybe just veered off right there at the end. It's not true. You go all the way back to the beginning. And I want to suggest to you that from the very beginning, what happens is here are men who come in and they say, we want you to help us destroy God's people. And when Balaam goes to God and asks permission, the first thing God says is, who are these people? Now, let me ask you, do you think God's going, I don't recognize them? Could you tell me? I think he's doing what God usually does when he asks questions. He's wanting you to verbalize the reality that's going on around you. It's what we do to our kids. What are you doing? Now, we know what they're doing. Our kids come and they say, listen, hey, a bunch of my friends and I want to go out to this very seedy part of town and hang out till 2 a.m. Would that be okay? I'm going to tell you, my first response to that is not just going to be no. I'm going to say, I just want you to say that out loud again. Let's just go right back over that. Because it shouldn't need an answer. And I think right from the start, that's what you're seeing with God. I shouldn't really have to answer this question. You want to go help people destroy my people? But then God does have to tell him. Because Balaam plays stupid the whole time. He says, yeah, that's who they are. So God says, all right, no. And then he comes out and he says, God said no. So they turn around and they walk out. And then they come back. And Balaam, instead of saying, hey, look, I can't have any part in this, he says, I'll go ask him again. When I was in high school one time, we had a choir concert that came up that was going to conflict with a worship service. And I told my choir director, I said, I cannot be there. I'm sorry, I have to go to worship. And he said, are you sure about that? So, oh yes, I'm sure. And he said, would it be all right if I called your parents and asked them for you? Here's what I told him. I said, you can call them, but make sure they know I knew the answer. I didn't want my parents thinking that I didn't know what to say and he was calling because I was dumbfounded. I didn't want to have that conversation when I got home. I wanted them to know I know the answer. Balaam doesn't know the answer, even after he's already been given. So he goes back to God again. And this time, and this is where the story might get confusing if we're not paying close attention, God says, go. And without any other conversation, we find this angel of the Lord, imperceptible to Balaam, but perceptible to Balaam's donkey, standing in the way until finally the donkey saves Balaam's life by just stopping. And Balaam starts to beat the donkey The donkey speaks, of course, you remember, and then Balaam's eyes are opened and he's able to see the angel of the Lord. And you might go, why is God putting an angel in the way to kill Balaam when he's just doing what God said to do? And I think, again, this is about communication. It's about communication from a legal standpoint or communication from a grace standpoint. Here Balaam has said, can I go do the thing that you said I cannot do? And God says, go. Now, have you ever had a situation, let us say with your wife? I'm going to give you an exaggerated, this has never happened, I just want to be clear. But I come in like on the weekend of our anniversary and I say, listen, I know we had plans, but some of the guys are getting a hunting trip together. And it's going to be a week and a half long and it just sounds great. Do you mind if I skip out on our plans for our anniversary? And she goes, fine. Go. Now, if I walk out of the house thinking that I have just received my wife's blessing, then I am not a capable person. Right? I need some help. Balaam walks out thinking that God is totally on board with this. God is not on board with this. God's already told him he's not on board with this. And frankly, I should know before asking, my wife is not going to be on board with this. And Balaam should already know. So the thing I'm wanting you to see is that all along what Balaam is doing is approaching God only in legal terms. He doesn't want to know what pleases God. He doesn't want to know what God truly wants and what God truly desires, because frankly, he could have known that without asking. But he comes saying, make the demands and I will comply with the explicit demands. Now there's a lesson for you. We must only follow God's explicit commands. Balaam did that. And look where it got him. I get so tired of people saying, if it's not commanded, we can't make inferences. I think it's exactly what God demanded Balaam to do. But you only do that if you really want a relationship. Otherwise, you play dumb, which is what we do. It's what we do with our parents. It's what we do with our spouses. We say, well, if you had wanted that, you could have just said so. And I know there are times where people aren't clear. I get that. But a lot of times they are. And then we just really don't want to do it. I remember telling my mom one time I didn't want to go to some family event. And she said, you don't have to if you don't want to. And what I heard, because I wanted to hear it, was, I'm happy for you to go elsewhere. Now, she wasn't. And I knew she wasn't. But I lied to myself and went on elsewhere saying, if you had wanted me to go, you should have said you wanted me to go. Well, she said it as clear as it needed to be said. And God is clear about what he wants to. That brings us to this question. Do I have to? As a parent, these must be your favorite words. You ever told your child to do something? Would you go take out the trash? Do I have to? Now I'll tell you what, it's not a good spot to be in as a parent when your kid asks you that kind of question. Do I have to? What are your options? I could just say, yeah, you do. And that's an option. I could say, no, you don't have to. You don't have to eat. You don't have to have a bed to sleep in. Right? I could take that sort of a approach. I could just take the approach of just not getting into the battle and raising spoiled children and saying, no, I don't want to even bother. I'll take it out. Those are all options. I tell you what I really want, what your parents really want, young people, what they would like to say. And you think, like when you say, do I have to, and you see your parents' eyes roll back in their head, and you're thinking, I just asked a question. The problem is it's not just a question. It is indicative of the nature of the relationship, and it's not the relationship they want. And I'm going to save you, if you would listen, a lot of lectures, or at least a lot of frustration. What your parents want is not just for you to take it out. They don't want to even have to ask you to take it out. They want you to be so invested in the home and in the family that you are looking for ways to participate. That you are looking for ways to contribute because you have received so much. And what a small thing it is to ask you to take out the trash. So that they want you to be looking not just for that, but what else could I be doing around here, Mom? I mean, imagine if you said that instead of do I have to. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't even recognize it needed to be taken. I'll get it right on that, and then when I get back, if there's anything else, you let me know, and I'll do that as well. And after she wakes up, she might have a list for you. But I'm going to tell you what. You would not believe the blessing and the freedom that would come by responding to your parents that way. But so many teenagers come, and myself included, come to their parents and they are begging for law and not grace. I will do the things you tell me to do and no more. Okay? You asked for it. And it's going to be law. I'm going to tell you, law will crush you. But grace would open up so many doors. When a Christian comes, Greg, when somebody comes and they say, do I really have to come to worship services? I'll tell you what, I feel like that parent. Are there any good answers? You could say, yeah, Hebrews 10:25 says you do. Just come. But what you really want to say is that you're asking the question means we got a problem. Because if I just tell you yes and you show up and you warm that pew from the time services start till it's over and you're here every time and you check that box and you go on unaffected by anything that happens here, then you are under law. But grace looks at Hebrews 10 and starts in verse 24 and says, not just should I be here, but what all should I be worrying about and thinking about while I'm here? How do I stir up my brothers and sisters to good works? How do I participate? How do I, thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, how do I meditate on the body of my Lord? But you can't get there if you're way over here saying, do I even have to be here? I don't know what the answer, in one way, I do know what the answer to that is. I know what the law answer to that is. But law is not all you need. You don't just need to be here, you need to be a part of what's happening here. It is frustrating. But I'll tell you what, on the receiving end of this, whether it's with our children or whether it's with members in the church, we need to be careful that we don't take the easy way out. It is tempting. It is tempting because we don't have time. It's tempting because those conversations are frustrating. Our children are tired of lectures. Church members are tired of sermons. Luke chapter 10 and verse 29. Luke chapter 10 and verse 29. You know the story leading up to the story of the Good Samaritan. You remember there in verse 25 it says, a scholar of the law stood up and was putting him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Incidentally, that's better than the rich young ruler who's listing off commands. Or is listed off the commands, says, I've done those. Here, he gets it. He's got the summary of the law. But he says, you have answered correctly, do this and you will live. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus doesn't say, I will point them out to you. He tells him a story. And when he gets done with the story, sometimes what people think the point is that your neighbor is everyone. I don't think that's the point of the story, because the question that he asks doesn't point in that direction. If you'll notice, it says, in verse 36, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's den? The question is not who was the neighbor on the receiving end. The question was who was the neighbor on the giving end. And the lawyer says the one who showed mercy toward him, and Jesus says, go and do the same. I think what just happened is here's a man who wants to minimize his responsibilities, and so he says, who is my neighbor? Either in kind of a fashion that says, like, how can you possibly know? Or he's saying, who all do I have to treat neighborly? And Jesus then tells a story and says, which one of these acted like a neighbor? And when he points out the right answer, I think what Jesus is saying to a man who wants to know who all does he have to be neighborly to, I think Jesus' point is, who have you ever been neighborly to? You know, sometimes people will say, how do we save the world? I tell you what, why don't you just go empty the dishwasher? Let's just start there. I want to just save I want the whole world's my neighbor. But you got one right next door you never talked to. How about that? Let's just start there. But that takes time. You know, Jesus could have said, everyone, just treat everyone kindly. He didn't say that. In fact, he was more demanding than that. He told him a story that made him think deeper than just a single answer to his question. I think it was Leon Malden telling a story one time about a lady in the congregation that had asked about the propriety of women working outside the home. And Leon went through a series of passages and principles talking about, you know, how and what the Bible has to say about that, and different scenarios and situations that might come up. And so he takes about 30 minutes to make an explanation, and the woman at the end goes, so yes or no? And what you want to say is, look, do you love the Lord? Then read this. And you'll be able to figure out what's a wise decision in your particular situation, and what's an unwise decision. What will wreck your home and what will help your home. Read this and love the Lord, and you can know what those answers are. But it takes time. You got to have those and you can't, like, at the end of that go, next time I'm just going to give them the answer. Don't do it. And when your kids come and they want simple answers, don't give them simple answers. Brother Waldron talks about in his book, The Generation that Knows Not God, or Knew Not God. He talks about in that book, here's these landmarks that God had told the people to set up so that they would have opportunities to tell their children. He posits a story of a father and his son on their way home, and they come by that monument by the River Jordan where they had crossed over, you know, the 12 stones that commemorate that event. And the boy says, what are these stones? And in one case, the father says, sit down and let me tell you about these 12 stones. But in another case, he says, that's got to do with when we came into the land, but I just don't have time to tell you about it. We've got to get home. It's getting dark. I'm going to tell you the second one sounds a lot more like what goes on in our homes when it comes to the stories of God's Word. And compare how much time we give to telling those stories in a way that relate the principle. We rise up when we lie down, we walk by the wayside, versus sitting them in front of that godless tube in our house and letting that tell them the stories that teach them to think in worldly ways. Teach them to think about God as something over here to the side who you check in with occasionally to make sure you don't just go completely in the ditch. He will not have that position in your life. That is a law position. But He wants a grace position in your life. I want to say one more thing about this idea of cultivating grace, and that is that when we cultivate grace, especially as we're the ones trying to bring others along. We need to cultivate it in ourselves, but as we're trying to cultivate it, for instance, in our children, we need to be thinking in terms of what is in everyone's best interest. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and there in verse 4, the Apostle Paul in this section is talking about the gift that he is going to be taking to the needy saints. And he says here in verse 3, he says, "For I testify that according to their ability, that is those in Macedonia, and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the grace of sharing in the ministry to the saints." Now you may have favor in your translation, but it's the same word, grace, God's grace, everything. But so here's what these people think is, if you would let me do this, if you would let me participate in this, that would be a grace to me. And Paul's over there saying, y'all don't have enough. Y'all don't need to contribute. Look, don't cut us out. We want to be a part of this. And maybe the part that they would be so small, it would be so insignificant. But Paul knows it's a big deal. And it means a lot to them. Several years ago, in 2011, when tornadoes swept through the state of Alabama, some of those tornadoes came through where my in-laws lived, and we went up there to cut trees and try to help with storm cleanup for several days. And one of the places we were there for quite some time, and the whole neighborhood, I mean, it's just everywhere, you know. And there's this fellow that pulled up on a four-wheeler with snacks and drinks on the back of his four-wheeler. Had to be in his 80s at least. And he shuffled up to us. He said, "Do y'all need any snacks? Y'all need any drinks?" And of course, we had been loaded down. People had been so generous. And we said, "No, we're good, thanks. We appreciate it." So he pulls off and goes on to the next place where people are working. And we see him come back around in about 45 minutes, and he says, do y'all need any snacks or drinks? We're good. I mean, we're just overflowing. We don't need it. He goes off again. He comes back the third time, and as I'm about to walk over to him and tell him again, we don't need anything, one of the older fellows that was there working grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Listen, every time you tell that old man there no, you are telling him he can't be a part of what we're doing. You ought to see his shoulders slump after you tell him no. Go take a drink and go take a snack from that man and tell him how much you appreciate it." And I want to tell you what, it made his day. He wanted to be a part. And you say, "Well, we don't need him." That's not the point. It's not just for you. It's for him. That's what God does for us. He lets us be. You think God needs us? He lets us be a part. And because these people are thinking in gracious terms, they're like, I get to be a part of what God is doing in Judea? What can we do? How can we help? Philippians chapter 4. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 17. Paul is talking about the aid that they have sent to him. And he says in verse 17, "Not that I seek the gift itself. I seek the fruit which increases to your account." I'll tell you what, that's the kind of thing somebody might say and you just almost wouldn't believe them. Almost sounds like a politician, you know. It's not that I really like the money. I'm just glad for you that you're able to present. Right. I think Paul means it. Paul genuinely is saying, I'm fine. I'm fine. But I know this is a good thing for you. And I'm glad for it, for you. Parents, I believe our children come here with a natural tendency towards a grace relationship. And we build that and we nurture that when they're little babies and when they're toddlers. And somewhere along the way, it turns into a law relationship. My mom says about 13, at least in my case. And then for about 5 or 6 years, pretty rough. And then maybe we can work it back to something resembling a grace relationship. I think one of the reasons that happens, I don't think it's necessary. I think some people say, well, just teenagers are going to be rebellious and they're going to have that. And I think there's some of that conflict that's going to come. But I don't think it necessarily has to be so disastrous. But I think one of the things that happens is when our children are very small, they want to participate in graceful ways. I cannot tell you how many times I have a 4-year-old come running and say, I want to help, I want to help, I want to help. And let me tell you the reality, and you know it. The job will not get done quicker. It will not get done even at the same pace. There will be no actual assistance. In fact, we may not get the job done if he comes to help. I say, come on. I say, you jump right in here. And we will clumsily work through this thing, because here's what I know. In 10 years, I'll be the one saying, you come help me. But I'll have told him no so many times that the only way I get it now is to demand it. You see, because in my mind, I am thinking in terms of grace of only what I can get. And if he can't give me anything, then I don't need him by my side. And then one day when he's big enough and strong enough, say, now I need you, son. But he needed me. And I didn't give that to him. And so parents, their teenagers get old enough that they're handy. And now you want them. Now you want them in the middle of it and want them helping. But you haven't cultivated that. You haven't accepted their fledgling efforts at help so that you have cultivated that love and desire to be alongside you. Tom Holly talks about his grandfather. I love to hear him talk about his grandfather. He said, I would have done anything to make my grandfather happy. That's the way your little kids are. And I think if you'll accept that all along the way, then you'll build it into something where even your teenager would do anything to make you happy. Now maybe that's not perfect, but I think it'd be closer to it. And I think we would also, the more important point, is we would be teaching them the nature of their relationship to God. Instead of accepting that it will always turn into simple demands and compliance, but actual loving participation. Because that's what we want more than anything, is not just to have teenagers who listen and do what we say. What we really want is to have children who grow up to love God even more than they love us. But I'm afraid what we do is we hand them off to the world, having left them with a very legal impression of what that relationship's like. Grace is demanding. It demands everything that we have. I don't want my children to grow past grace and into law. Law is so much less in every way than grace. It is less in what you give, and it is far less than what you receive. What about you this evening? Are you a participant with God in grace? Or are you like the teenager demanding a law relationship, asking, do I have to? If you demand that law relationship, let me just say, God will give it to you and it will crush you. Because you can never live up. Grace may ask what I must do. I do want to say this. It is not that you can never ask, what should I do? But saying, what should I do, so that I can arrive at knowing what it is to please God, is far different than someone who says, what do I have to do? That's not it. But if you come as the willing servant of the Master, and you say, what next? Lord, what next? And then you come and you find a Master ready to show you hand in hand what is next. Glory. That's what's next. If there's anybody who needs to obey the gospel call and submit their lives, graciously submit their lives to the grace that they would receive from their Lord, well then won't you come while we stand and while we sing.